The train whistle faded into the Alabama heat like a prayer lost in church rafters. Catherine Whitmore stepped onto the wooden platform at Marrow Creek Station, her leather suitcase heavy in her hand, her teaching certificate folded neat in her coat pocket. The year was 1931, and the world felt broken in ways that newspapers couldn't capture. But here, in this small town where cotton fields stretched to the horizon, she hoped to find something whole again. The station master tipped his hat, but said nothing. His eyes held the same strange quiet she would come to know in every adult face in Marrow Creek, a silence that seemed to press down like storm clouds before rain. "The school's just up the road," he finally said, pointing toward a red dirt path that disappeared between pine trees. "Mrs. Henderson will meet you there." Catherine walked the dusty mile in the morning heat, her shoes collecting Alabama clay with every step. The countryside was beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are. Fields left fallow, farmhouses with sagging porches, and everywhere the red earth that seemed to glow like embers in the sun. The Marrow Creek School sat in a clearing surrounded by old oak trees. It was a simple wooden building, painted white, but faded to the color of old bones. A bell tower rose from the center, its bells silent in the still air. Behind the school, she could see the outline of a small cellar, its wooden doors flat against the ground like a grave marker. Mrs. Henderson waited on the front steps. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back tight, wearing a dress the color of mourning doves. When she spoke, her voice was soft as dust. "Miss Whitmore," she said, rising from the steps, "we're grateful you've come. The children have been difficult since their last teacher left." "Difficult how?" Catherine asked, setting her suitcase down in the shade. Mrs. Henderson glanced toward the school windows, where small faces had appeared and then quickly disappeared. "They don't speak much anymore, not above a whisper, and they have strange habits." Catherine followed her inside. The schoolroom was small but neat, with wooden desks arranged in rows and a blackboard that had been scrubbed clean. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong, like walking into a house where someone had just stopped breathing. 23 children, Mrs. Henderson continued, her hands folded tight. Ages 6 to 14, most from the farms around here. Good families, God-fearing people. But the children. She paused, searching for words. They listen to things we can't hear. That first day, Catherine rang the bell and watched them come. 23 children walking slow across the red dirt yard, their eyes downcast, their footsteps soft as whispers. They filed into the classroom without a word, taking their seats with the careful quiet of mice in a house with cats. "Good morning, children," Catherine said, her voice bright in the heavy air. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," they replied, but so quiet she had to strain to hear them. She tried to teach them arithmetic, reading, the names of presidents. But their attention drifted like smoke. They watched the windows. They tilted their heads, as if listening to something far away. And when she asked questions, their answers came in voices barely louder than breath. At recess, she expected them to run and shout like children do. Instead, they walked to different spots in the yard and lay down on their bellies, pressing their ears to the red earth. They stayed that way for long minutes, perfectly still, like they were trying to hear the heartbeat of the world. Catherine walked among them, her shadow falling across their small forms. "What are you listening for?" she asked the girl with braids the color of corn silk. The girl looked up with eyes too old for her face. "The voices," she whispered. "They're down there under the ground. They want us to remember." "Remember what?" But the girl had already turned back to the earth, her ear pressed close to the dirt. That afternoon, after the children had walked home along the dusty roads, Catherine stayed behind to clean the blackboard and organize her lesson plans. The school felt different when empty, not peaceful, but waiting, like a held breath. She walked outside to explore the grounds. Behind the school, near the tree line, she found the cellar she had noticed earlier. It was small, maybe 8 feet square, with wooden doors that lay flat against the ground. But the doors were held shut with more than just a latch. Heavy boards had been nailed across them, and those boards were old, the wood gray and weathered, the nails rusted deep. Catherine knelt and ran her fingers along the boards. Someone had worked hard to keep these doors closed. The question was why. Those haven't been opened in years. Catherine turned to find Mrs. Henderson standing behind her, her face pale in the evening light. "What's down there?" Catherine asked. "Storage," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "Old school supplies. Nothing important." But her eyes said something different. Her eyes said, "Don't ask. Don't wonder. Don't try to understand." That night, Catherine lay in her small room above the general store, listening to the sounds of a country town settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A screen door squeaked closed. And underneath it all, so faint she might have imagined it, she thought she heard something else. Voices calling from far away, like people shouting from the bottom of a well. She rose and went to her window. Across the town, the school sat dark among the trees. But in the moonlight, she could see small figures in the yard. Children who should have been home in bed, lying on the ground with their ears pressed to the earth, listening to something the adults had forgotten how to hear. By morning, they were gone. But the red dirt held the impressions of their small bodies, like shadows burned into the ground by some terrible light. Catherine walked to school early that day, her mind full of questions. The children arrived as quiet as before, filing into their seats without meeting her eyes. But now she noticed things she had missed. The way they flinched when she walked too heavy across the floor, the way they watched the windows, as if expecting something to appear, the way they all seemed to breathe together, like one frightened animal with 23 hearts. During morning lessons, she found herself studying their faces. These children carried secrets too heavy for their years. And whatever they heard in the ground, whatever made them whisper instead of shout, whatever kept those cellar doors nailed shut, it was eating them alive, one quiet day at a time. At lunch, she made a decision that would change everything. She would listen too. She would find out what voices called from beneath the Marrow Creek School, even if it meant joining the children in their strange and terrible silence. September arrived in Marrow Creek like a gentle apology after the burning heat of August. The leaves on the oak trees began their slow turn from green to gold, and morning fog settled in the hollows between the hills. Catherine had been teaching for 3 weeks now, and slowly, carefully, the children were beginning to trust her. It started with small things. A girl named Ruby began to raise her hand during arithmetic lessons, though her voice still came soft as falling leaves. A boy called Thomas smiled when she complimented his penmanship, the first smile she had seen cross any of their faces. And during recess, they no longer scattered to opposite corners of the yard when she approached them lying on the ground, listening to their impossible voices. "Miss Catherine," Ruby said one morning, tugging at her skirt with fingers still stained from helping her mother with the morning milking. "Would you like to hear them too?" Catherine knelt down beside the girl, her knees pressing into the red Alabama dirt. "Hear who, Ruby?" "The children under the ground. They have names, you know." Catherine's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice calm and gentle. "Were their names?" Ruby closed her eyes and pressed her ear to the earth, as natural as listening to a seashell for the ocean sound. "There's Mary. She's 6 years old, same as me. And Jacob, who's 8. And little Sarah, who's only 4 and still cries for her mama." Other children gathered around them in a circle, drawn by the rare sound of Ruby speaking above a whisper. They nodded as she spoke, their faces serious and sad. How many children are there?" Catherine asked. 23, said a voice from behind her. Catherine turned to see Samuel, a thin boy of 10 with dark hair that fell across his eyes like a curtain. He was the quietest of all the children, the one who seemed to carry the heaviest burden of whatever secret they all shared. "The same number as you children here above ground," Catherine said, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. Samuel nodded. Then he knelt and began to draw in the dirt with a stick. His small hands moved with careful purpose, sketching the outline of face, a girl with braided hair and a sad smile. Next to her, he drew another face, then another. "This is Mary," he said, pointing to the first drawing. "This is Jacob. This is Sarah." Catherine watched, mesmerized, as Samuel drew face after face in the red dirt. 23 faces in total, each one detailed and distinct. These weren't the rough drawings of a child playing in the dust. These were portraits drawn by someone who had seen these faces clearly, who knew the curve of each smile and the shape of each tear. "Samuel," Catherine whispered, "how do you know what they look like?" The boy looked up at her with eyes too old for his face. "They show us. In dreams sometimes. But mostly when we lie down and listen real close, we can see them in our minds, clear as daylight." That afternoon, after the children had walked home along their dusty roads, Catherine stayed behind to prepare lessons for the next day. But her mind kept drifting to Samuel's drawings, now smoothed away by the wind, but burned forever in her memory. She found herself standing before Mrs. Henderson's locked desk at the back of the classroom. Catherine had noticed it before, a heavy wooden desk with brass handles and a lock that looked older than the school itself. Mrs. Henderson kept the key on a chain around her neck and never opened the desk while Catherine was present. But Mrs. Henderson had left early that day, complaining of a headache that seemed to come whenever the children spoke too much about their underground voices. And in her hurry to leave, she had forgotten to lock the desk completely. The brass key sat in the keyhole, turned but not removed. Catherine's hands trembled as she turned the key and pulled open the heavy drawer. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed papers, old lesson plans, and attendance records dating back years. But underneath these ordinary things, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, she discovered a collection of photographs. Her breath caught in her throat. The photographs were old, the kind taken with long exposure times that made everyone look serious and still. They showed children, 23 children, standing in front of the same oak trees that still shaded the schoolyard. The clothing was different, older-fashioned, from perhaps 15 or 20 years before. But the faces... Catherine spread the photographs on the desk, her hands shaking. The faces in these old pictures matched exactly the faces Samuel had drawn in the dirt. Mary with her braided hair, Jacob with his crooked front tooth, little Sarah with her wide, frightened eyes. At the bottom of the stack, she found a newspaper clipping, brown with age and brittle as autumn leaves. The headline read, "Tragic fire claims 23 at Marrow Creek School. Children trapped in cellar during storm. No survivors found." The date was September 15th, 1916. 15 years ago, almost to the day. Catherine sank into Mrs. Henderson's chair, the weight of understanding settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The children above ground weren't imagining voices. They were hearing the voices of children who had died here, in the very place where they now played and learned and pressed their ears to the earth. The newspaper article told the story in spare, careful words. A terrible storm had struck during school hours. Lightning had hit the building, starting a fire that spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The teacher, a young woman not much older than Catherine, had tried to get all the children to safety in the cellar beneath the school. But the cellar doors had jammed shut, trapping them underground as smoke and flame consumed the building above. All 23 children had died, along with their teacher. Their bodies were never recovered. The cellar had collapsed, sealing them forever beneath tons of earth and rubble. The school had been rebuilt exactly where it stood before, on top of their unmarked grave. Catherine's hands shook as she folded the newspaper clipping and returned it to the blue cloth. Now she understood why the cellar doors were nailed shut, why the adults spoke in whispers when they thought the children couldn't hear, why Mrs. Henderson's eyes held such terrible knowledge. The children of Marrow Creek weren't just hearing voices from the ground. They were hearing the voices of children just like them, children who had died in terror and confusion, children who had been forgotten by everyone except the earth itself. As September deepened and the nights grew longer, Catherine found herself lying awake, listening to the sounds of the small town settling into sleep. But now she heard something else beneath the familiar sounds of night, a soft calling, like children singing lullabies to themselves in the dark. The next morning, she watched her 23 students file into their seats, and she saw them differently now. They weren't just carrying the weight of their own secrets. They were carrying the weight of 23 other children's unfinished stories, 23 voices that had no other way to be heard except through the listening ears and gentle hearts of the living. The question that kept Catherine awake at night was simple but terrible. What did the dead children want? What were they trying to say through the whispered words and frightened drawings of the children above? And what would happen if those voices were never properly heard and their story never properly told? Chapter 3. What the Earth Remembers. October rain softens the red clay, and the voices grow stronger. Miss Catherine finds the courage to ask the questions no one else will. In the county records office, she discovers what happened to the children who came before, and why the school was built exactly where it stands. Some ground never forgets what it has swallowed. October came to Marrow Creek with gentle rain that fell for days without stopping. The red clay turned soft and dark, like earth that remembered old tears. Catherine watched from her classroom window as her 23 students pressed their ears closer to the ground during recess, their small bodies curled against the dampness. The rain seemed to make the voices clearer, stronger, as if water helped carry sound up through the layers of soil and time. "They're singing today," Ruby told her, water droplets clinging to her yellow hair like tiny diamonds. All 23 of them, singing together. Catherine knelt beside the girl, her own dress soaking up the rain. "What are they singing, Ruby?" "A song about going home," Ruby whispered, her eyes closed as she listened. "But they can't remember where home is anymore." That evening, Catherine sat in her small room above the general store, listening to the rain tap against her window like fingers asking to come inside. She had made a decision that afternoon, one that frightened her but felt as necessary as breathing. She would go to the county courthouse in Birmingham and find the real records of what happened in 1916. Mrs. Henderson's newspaper clipping had told her the basic facts, but Catherine needed to understand the whole truth. The next morning, she told Mrs. Henderson she felt unwell and needed a day to rest. It wasn't entirely a lie. The weight of keeping the children's secret had settled in her stomach like a stone, making her feel sick with worry and responsibility. The train to Birmingham left at dawn, and Catherine sat by the window watching the Alabama countryside roll past in shades of red and gold. October had painted the world in colors that reminded her of the children's faces when they spoke about their underground friends, beautiful and sad at the same time. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a grand building of white stone and tall columns, the kind of place where important decisions were made by important men. Catherine felt small walking up its wide steps, her simple teacher's dress and worn shoes marking her as someone who didn't belong in such a place. The records clerk was a thin man with spectacles who looked annoyed when she explained what she needed. "School record for 1916? He shook his head. "Most of those burned in the fire of 29. What's left is incomplete." "Please," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "I'm a teacher at Marrow Creek. I need to understand what happened to the children." Something in her tone must have touched him, because his expression softened. "Marrow Creek School," he said quietly. "I remember my father talking about that tragedy. Terrible thing. Come with me." He led her down a long hallway lined with filing cabinets that seemed to stretch forever, each one holding pieces of other people's stories. At the back of the building, in a room that smelled of old paper and forgotten time, he pulled out 3 dusty folders. "This is what survived," he said, placing them on a wooden table. "The official investigation report. Some correspondence between the county and the state. A few personal letters from families." Catherine's hands trembled as she opened the first folder. Inside were typed pages, carbon copies faded with age, telling the story of September 15th, 1916 in careful, official language that somehow made it more terrible, not less. The fire had started at 2:47 in the afternoon. Lightning from a sudden thunderstorm had struck the school's bell tower, sending sparks into the dry wooden roof. The teacher, Miss Elizabeth Harper, had acted quickly to evacuate the children. But the main doors had jammed, swollen shut by the rain that came with the storm. Miss Harper had led all 23 children to the cellar entrance behind the school, thinking they would be safe underground until help arrived. But as they huddled in the small space, the burning building above had collapsed, sealing the cellar doors with tons of flaming debris. The volunteer fire brigade had arrived within an hour, but it was too late. The building was completely destroyed, and the cellar entrance was buried under a mountain of burning wood and twisted metal. They had dug for 3 days, working through the night by lantern light, but the cellar had caved in completely. No bodies were ever recovered. The official cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation, but Catherine knew that was just words on paper trying to make sense of something that could never make sense. 24 people disappearing into the earth as if they had never existed at all. But it was the second folder that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. Inside were letters from the families, written in the weeks after the tragedy. Letter after letter asking the same desperate questions. When would their children be buried properly? When would there be a memorial? When would someone acknowledge that their babies had lived and died and deserved to be remembered? The county's responses were short and cold. The site was too dangerous to excavate further. The cost of proper recovery was too high. It would be better for everyone if the community moved on and built something positive where the tragedy had occurred. A new school, they suggested, built right on top of the old foundation, so that children's laughter could fill the space where children had died. Catherine found herself crying as she read a letter from Mary's mother, written in shaky handwriting. Please don't forget my little girl. Please don't let them build over her like she never was. She loved to sing. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. She was only 6 years old, but she had so much love in her heart. Please remember her. But they had forgotten. All of them. The new school had been built exactly where the old one stood, and over time, the story became something people didn't talk about anymore. The children who died became ghosts in the truest sense, forgotten by the living world, remembered only by the earth that held their bones. The third folder contained architectural plans for the new school, drawn up in early 1917. Catherine spread them out on the table and studied them carefully. The new building had been positioned exactly over the old cellar, as if the designers wanted to make sure nothing would ever disturb the ground beneath. But looking at the plans, Catherine noticed something that made her heart race. The new cellar had been built slightly to the north of where the old one had collapsed. The school's current cellar, the one with the nailed-shut doors, wasn't where the children had died at all. The children were buried directly under the main classroom, under the desks where her 23 students sat every day, under the floor where Catherine walked back and forth, teaching lessons about arithmetic and history and the proper way to form letters. No wonder the voices were so clear. No wonder the children above could hear them so easily. The dead children of 1916 were lying just a few feet below their living brothers and sisters, separated only by wooden floorboards and 15 years of silence. As the train carried her back to Marrow Creek through the October twilight, Catherine stared out at the darkening fields and made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't bring the dead children back, but she could make sure they were remembered. She could make sure their names were spoken aloud, their story told, their short lives honored. The question was whether the people of Marrow Creek would let her, or whether they would choose, once again, to bury the truth as deep as they had buried the children who had called this place home. November came to Marrow Creek with frost that turned the world silver and silent. The red clay hardened under the cold, and for the first time since Catherine had arrived, the voices from beneath the ground grew quiet. Her 23 students still pressed their ears to the earth during recess, but they came away looking confused and frightened, like children who had lost something precious. "They're getting harder to hear," Samuel told her on a morning when his breath came out in white puffs. "It's like they're falling asleep, or maybe—" He paused, his young face worried. "Maybe they're giving up." Catherine's heart ached as she watched her students grow more restless each day. Without the comfort of their underground friends, they seemed lost. Ruby cried during arithmetic lessons. Thomas stared out the window instead of practicing his letters. And Samuel drew nothing at all in the dirt, his stick lying forgotten beside him. That evening, Catherine sat at her small table by lamplight, writing a letter she knew would end her teaching career in Marrow Creek. But some things mattered more than jobs or reputations or the approval of adults who preferred silence to truth. She wrote to the superintendent of schools, to the county commissioners, to anyone who might listen. She told them about the children buried beneath the classroom floor. She told them about the families who had never received proper burials for their babies. She told them about 23 living children who carried the weight of 23 dead children every single day. Most importantly, she told them what needed to be done. The responses came quickly, delivered by men in dark suits who arrived on the morning train with stern faces and legal documents. They met with Mrs. Henderson in the schoolhouse while Catherine taught her lessons, their voices carrying through the thin walls in angry whispers. "Disturbing the peace of the community," she heard one say. "Filling children's heads with nonsense," said another. "The matter was settled 15 years ago," said a third. But Catherine had expected this. She had one more card to play, one more truth to tell. That afternoon, she dismissed her students early and asked them to wait in the schoolyard. Then she walked to the supply closet and retrieved the hammer and pry bar she had borrowed from the general store. The men in suits watched in shock as she marched past them and out the back door of the school. At the cellar entrance, Catherine knelt and began working at the nails that held the boards across the doors. Each nail came free with a screech of rusted metal, like the earth itself crying out in protest at being kept secret for so long. "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Henderson," called from behind her, her voice sharp with panic. "What do you think you're doing?" "What should have been done 15 years ago," Catherine replied, not looking up from her work. The last nail came free with a sound like a gunshot. Catherine pulled the heavy boards away and stared down at the cellar doors. They were weathered gray, but still solid. She lifted one door, then the other, revealing stone steps that led down into darkness. The smell that rose from the cellar was not the smell of death, as she had feared. It was the smell of old earth and forgotten time, of secrets kept too long in darkness. Catherine climbed down the steps, her students gathering at the entrance above her, their faces pale with anticipation. At the bottom, she found exactly what she had expected, and exactly what the town had tried so hard to hide. The cellar was empty. Completely, utterly empty. Just stone walls and a dirt floor that had been swept clean. This was not where the children had died. This was just storage, exactly as Mrs. Henderson had said. The real grave was 15 feet away, under the classroom floor where her students sat every day. But Catherine had not come here looking for bones. She had come looking for proof of what the adults of Marrow Creek had done, and she found it. On the stone wall, scratched deep with a piece of metal or sharp stone, were 23 names. The names of the children who had died in 1916, carved by someone who had refused to let them be forgotten entirely. Next to each name was a small cross, and beneath the crosses, someone had carved a single word in careful letters. Remember. Catherine climbed back up into the pale November sunlight, tears streaming down her face. Her 23 students stood in a circle around the cellar entrance, their eyes wide with understanding. "They were real," Ruby whispered. "Mary and Jacob and Sarah. They were all real. They were your age," Catherine told them, her voice breaking. "They went to school right here. They played in this same yard. They were just like you, and they died, and the grown-ups decided it was easier to forget them than to remember them properly." Samuel stepped forward, his thin shoulders straight with sudden courage. "What do we do now, Miss Catherine?" Catherine looked around at the men in suits, at Mrs. Henderson, at the parents who had begun arriving after hearing rumors that something was happening at the school. All of them wore the same expression, the look of people who had been caught in a lie they had told themselves for so long they had almost believed it was true. "Now we remember them the way they should have been remembered from the beginning," Catherine said. She walked back into the classroom and retrieved the photographs she had found in Mrs. Henderson's desk. One by one, She showed them to her students, speaking each name aloud. Mary Henderson, age 6. Jacob Mills, age 8. Sarah Thompson, age 4. And on through all 23 names, until each face had been seen and each life had been acknowledged by voices that could speak above a whisper. Her students began to cry, not the quiet, careful tears they had learned to shed in silence, but the full, honest tears of children who had finally been given permission to feel everything they had been carrying. Miss Whitmore, one of the men in suits, said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "You are dismissed from your position, effective immediately. You will pack your belongings and leave Marrow Creek on the evening train." Catherine nodded. She had known this moment would come. But as she looked at her 23 students, she saw something that made her heart sing despite everything. For the first time since she had arrived in Marrow Creek, they were looking at the adults with clear, unafraid eyes. They were standing straight and tall. They were no longer whispering. "We won't forget them," Samuel said, his young voice carrying across the schoolyard like a bell. "We'll remember Mary and Jacob and Sarah and all the rest. We'll tell our children about them, and our children will tell their children." The other students nodded, their faces solemn with new purpose. And Catherine knew that while she might be leaving Marrow Creek, the truth would stay behind with them. 23 living children would carry the memory of 23 dead children into the future, ensuring that no one would ever again be buried in silence and forgotten. That evening, as Catherine packed her small suitcase by lamplight, she heard something that made her pause and smile through her tears. From the direction of the school came the sound of children singing, not the whispered lullabies of the dead, but the full, joyous voices of the living. Her work in Marrow Creek was finished, but the real work, the work of remembering, of honoring, of refusing to let tragedy be buried in shame, that work would continue long after the train carried her away into the November night.